Warning, this content may be upsetting or disturbing to some audiences. Welcome to Ghost House. If you enjoy my scary stories, please post some ghost emojis in the comments. The first creepy story starts like this. I was almost friends with a monster when I was 11 years old. I would have preferred a human friend, but my family had just moved to a new city where everyone was cold and distant. My father promised that I would meet new people at school, but there were still a few weeks of summer and I had nothing to do. Elisa Williams was the one I really wanted to be friends with. She lived next door in a beautiful gray house with a high fenced yard. I used to sit with my back to the fence and listen to her playing and giggling, the sound bubbling up like music made for everyone but me. I wasn't brave enough to introduce myself, but after a few days of moping around the house my mother volunteered to do it for me. I stood behind her, carrying a basket of cookies while she knocked on the neighbor's door. "Elisa." The man who opened it looked like a poorly shaved bear. "Get over here and meet your new friend." "We're busy," came the shrill response from somewhere deeper in the house. My mother marveled at the woodworking and craftsmanship and asked the age of the venerable structure. "Now, Elisa," the bear bellowed. "I know you're alone up there." A short, angry sigh, like what circus lions must do before they're forced onto the stage. Then footsteps creaking down the stairs. "I've got cookies," I supplied hopefully. "Elisa spends all day playing by herself," the bear said. "She's been so lonely since her mother passed. Some company will be good for her." I thought about the giggling I heard through the fence, and I didn't understand how someone could have such a good time on their own. Elisa appeared a moment later, her head hanging low in surly obedience. She wore shorts and long socks pulled halfway up her thighs, one bright green and the other purple. That's all I really saw, because I was so embarrassed that I couldn't look up from the basket of cookies I held out. Elisa snatched the whole basket and briskly turned around again. I glimpsed a wave of black hair, curly like her father's but not so wild. After a few steps she turned to glare over her shoulder with the expression a vegan might give a barbecue. "Well, are you coming or not?" I hadn't taken my second step before she cut in. "Shoes off." I hasted to obey. "No, the socks stay on." "What are you, some kind of barbarian?" "No, ma'am." I don't know why I said that, but I was scared of her and I didn't want to give her any reason to send me away. Elisa seemed satisfied with the answer though, and she permitted me to follow her up the stairs toward her room. I felt like I was on solid ground until she said, "We don't need any more friends. None of our games have room for a third person." "Your dad said." "He isn't my dad. He killed my father and took me prisoner." "Oh, yes," she said, pivoting her socked heel on the wooden floor so smoothly that she seemed to almost float. "But that's okay, because sometimes he brings me little boys to eat." I could only hope that my stunned silence was mistaken for composure. Elisa rolled her eyes and opened the door to her room. "Just kidding. You're not stupid, are you?" I didn't realize I was holding my breath until that moment. "I'm sorry. That wasn't a fair question. Most stupid people don't know they're stupid, and I suppose it's perfectly fine if you are, as long as you don't try to perform surgery, or vote, or do anything a normal person would do," Elisa rambled. The stairway and hall we passed were heavily decorated with framed portraits, hanging tapestries, and ornate tables littered with precious and intricate things. It was in stark contrast to Elisa's room, which had a simple metal frame bed in the corner and a dark wood cabinet on the other side. The walls were painted black, and the window was concealed beneath a thick curtain. There was nothing on the hardwood floor to disrupt the monastic austerity. "How do you play games without any toys?" I asked. "We play blood games," she said, stressing the plural again. "The kind that need magic to work. You do know about magic, don't you?" "Yeah, sure. Of course." I didn't want to say anything more to betray my ignorance. I reached for a cookie from the basket, but she slapped my hand away. I stood in disbelief as she ate one of the cookies herself. "My mother taught me after she passed," Elisa said casually, moving to set the cookies on the cabinet. She retrieved something and turned to face me again. "If you want to play, then you'll need to give me your hand." "What do you mean, after she passed?" I tentatively stretched out to her. "Now close your eyes." She could have told me to jump out the window and I probably would have done it. She had the sweetest smile on her face, and the soft brush of her fingers tracing my palm made me blush. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "Don't scream. Mother hates screamers." I opened my eyes a sliver, just in time to see a metallic flash in the air. Elisa's grip tightened around my wrist while her free hand gouged a needle into the center of my palm. I didn't scream exactly. It was more of a shrieking yelping sound, like a rabbit trying skydiving for the first time. I tore my hand away with the needle still in it, blood freely running between my fingers. "Come back here!" Elisa shouted. "You're going to make a mess." We both dashed for the door. I hesitated to avoid running into her, but she pushed me aside and didn't slow until she'd slammed it shut and locked it from the inside. "You're wasting the blood. Give me your hand." "No. You'll stab me again." I gingerly pulled the needle out of the skin, prompting a fresh swell of blood. I felt dizzy. "Baby," she snorted. "That hurt slightly more than the needle. You're already bleeding, so I don't need to stab you, now do I? Here, wipe some on me." She offered me the back of her hand. Bewildered, I rubbed a long smear on her pale skin. Her dark eyes sparkled as she watched with eager fascination. I almost took the opportunity to flee, but I couldn't resist asking. "How does blood magic work?" "Mother said that when the world was young, all living things were connected and the same blood flowed from one to the next." Elisa plucked the needle from my fingers and pricked her clean hand daintily to draw forth a single drop of blood. We started to fight one another though, and it got worse and worse until we had to pull apart into separate entities. We became so distant that we started taking different shapes, and some animals even preyed upon others until we forgot that we were ever the same. The blood is the only part of us that never forgot. Using the nail of one index finger, she deftly traced a pattern in my blood. A circle, with a triangle inside, and a square inside that, and perhaps even a tiny pentagon within. With deep concentration she pressed the single drop of her blood into the center of the design. "Now what are you doing?" I asked. She smiled, but the gesture seemed strained and unnatural, like a dog baring its teeth for a dog food commercial. "Duh," she said. "I'm making magic." And she was. The pattern of blood on her hand was glowing. Softly at first, but growing brighter in even pulses. My heart began to race with excitement, and the pulsing light increased to match its rhythm. "What's it do?" I asked. "I'm going to grow you a friend," she said. "That's what you want, isn't it?" I wanted to tell her that I didn't need a friend anymore, because I had her. But we don't always get what we want, even from ourselves. Especially from ourselves. "Yeah, sure. That's what I came here for," I said. "Okay, watch." The light grew stronger, but I couldn't look away. The pattern was moving now. The triangle was turning within the circle, and the square within that, which moved in the opposite direction. And from the center grew a red stalk, like a time-lapsed bean struggling through her skin to sprout and curl into the air. Within a breathless moment the stalk had grown over a foot. The veins of Elisa's hand glowed beneath the skin like a network of roots. And from that strange plant, an even stranger fruit began to swell. "What is his name?" Elisa asked. How about Sid?" The fruit looked like an organ with a face. I didn't know what a fetus looked like at the time, but when I saw pictures when I was older I knew that's what it was. "How big will he be?" I inquired. "I want to be taller than he is." Elisa smiled. "What?" I said. "We'll be playing sports and stuff. I want to win." "What does Sid like to eat?" she asked. I glanced around the empty room, spotting the basket. "Cookies, I guess." It was larger now. I could make out tiny hands and feet pressing against its transparent cocoon. "And what does he love?" Her voice was fainter now, straining with exertion. Her glowing veins extended all the way down her arm now, and for the first time, I realized the concentration on her face was mixed with pain. "I don't know. I don't think I like this game. I don't want to play anymore." "You can't stop now." "What does Sid love?" Elisa took a sharp intake of breath and grimaced. The plant had stopped growing, and the swiftly gorging fruit was about the size of a watermelon. How was it getting so big? Was it filling up with her blood? "Stop it," I said. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "Make it go back. Cut it off." "It's not in it," she grunted. "His name is Sid, and he is already alive. You have to tell me what he loves or he will be nothing but." "I hate it. I hate him. Make him go away, please. Hurry. You're part of the spell too. I can't do this alone," she said. It wasn't a watermelon anymore. It was the size of a dog and beginning to grow coarse fur. Now it was heavy enough that Elisa had to kneel and rest it on the ground. The hands and feet were becoming more defined and solid by the second. Its eyes fluttered once, and then opened to pierce me with pale, sightless orbs. "Mr. Williams!" I screamed. "Mr. Williams, help! It's hurting her!" Thunderous footsteps sounded on the stairs. but the wretched thing reacted to the noise and flailed its arms. One wild claw pierced straight through its encompassing sack and clawed the open air an inch from my face. Bright red fingers clutched the tattered opening and ripped it wide in a rush of blood. All at once Sid was free and on the ground, standing almost as tall as me. Then someone was pounding on the door. It was still locked. "What's going on in there?" The voice opposite the door cried out. "Elisa? Are you okay?" She lay panting on the ground. The blood was beginning to evaporate into a thick red mist. I choked and fell to the ground to avoid breathing in the heavy, wet air. The tattered sack, the discarded dying stem, both withering before my eyes. Sid was crouched in terror, its matted blue fur showing through the evaporating blood. "Open the door. Boy, are you in there?" I crawled across the ground to unlock the door. More pounding, louder and more desperate than ever. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Sid flinching at each resounding crash. The instant I fully turned away from it to unlock the door, I heard Elisa scream. I pounded upon the lock and the enormous pressure on the other side made the door spring like a trap. The man was roaring, but it was too late. Elisa had been savagely disemboweled. Sid loomed over her, digging through the contents of her stomach as though searching for something. When it turned to face Mr. Williams' onslaught, it was shoveling a bloody, glutinous clump into its mouth. Mr. Williams almost caught it, but it bounded away just in time. The bearman moved to the window to block its retreat, but he missed again when Sid lunged for the basket on the cabinet instead. By the time Mr. Williams caught up with it, Sid had already fled through the door. "It's my fault." I heaved for air. Mr. Williams knelt over his daughter, clutching her viscera-soaked body to his chest. "I could have stopped it," I sobbed. "I could have told it not to hurt anyone. I'm so sorry." "We need to get out of the house," he said. I followed him downstairs, though I knew it wouldn't return. There was nothing left to satisfy it here. The monster had been born with but one desire, and it would stop at nothing to get it. A cookie monster was born that day. This is the end of the story. Now let's move on to the next one. I don't know when you're going to read this, but I can tell you when it started. I was out for a walk alone in the woods when the entity came for me. It was beyond a blur. It was, for lack of a better term, absence of meaning. Where it hid, there were no trees. Where it crept closer, there was no grass. Through the arc it leapt at me, there was no breeze of motion. There was no air at all. As it struck, I felt the distinct sensation of claws puncturing me somewhere unseen. Somewhere I'd never felt before. My hands and arms and legs and torso seemed fine and I wasn't bleeding. But I knew I'd been injured somehow. As I fearfully ran back home, I could tell that I was less. I was vaguely tired, and it was hard to focus at times. The solution at that early stage was easy. A big cup of coffee helped me feel normal again. For a while, that subtle drain on my spirit became lost in the ebb and flow of caffeine in my system. You could say my life began that week, actually, because that was when I met Mark. She and I got along great, though, to be honest, I'm pretty sure I fell in love with her over the phone before we even met. It was almost as if the strong emotions of that first week made the entity fight back. It was still with me, latched onto some invisible part of my being. The first few incidents were minor, and I hardly worried about them. The color of a neighbor's car changed from dark blue to black one morning, and I stared at it before shaking my head and shrugging off the difference. 2 days later, at work, a coworker's name changed from Fred to Dan. I carefully asked around, but everyone said his name had always been Dan. I figured I'd just been mistaken. Then, as ridiculous as this sounds, I was peeing in my bathroom at home when I suddenly found myself on a random street. I was still in my pajamas, pants down, and urinating, but now in full view of a dozen people at a bus stop. Horrified, I pulled up my clothes and ran before someone called the cops. I did manage to get home, but the experience forced me to admit that I was still in danger. The entity was doing something to me, and I didn't understand how to fight back. Mar showed up that evening, but she had her own key. "Hey," I asked her with confusion. "How'd you get a key?" She just laughed. "You're cute. Are you sure you're okay with this?" She opened a door and entered a room full of boxes. I know living together is a big step, especially when we've only been dating 3 months. Living together? I'd literally just met her the week before. Thing was, my mother had always called me a smart cookie for a reason. I knew when to shut my up. Instead of causing a scene, I told her everything was fine, and then I went straight to my room and began investigating. My things were just as I had left them, with no sign of a 3-month gap in habitation, but I did find something out of the ordinary: the date. I shivered angrily as I processed the truth. The entity had eaten 3 months of my life. What the hell was I facing? What kind of creature could consume pieces of one's soul like that? I'd missed the most exciting part of a new relationship, and I would never understand any shared stories or in-jokes from that period. Something absurdly precious had been taken from me, and I was furious. That fury helped suppress the entity. I never imbibed alcohol. I drank coffee religiously. I checked the date every time I woke up. For 3 years, I managed to live each day while observing nothing more than minor alterations. A social fact here and there, someone's job, how many kids they had, that sort of thing, the layout of nearby streets, the time my favorite television show aired, that kind of thing. Always, those changes reminded me the creature still had its claws sunk into my spirit. Not once in 3 years did I ever let myself zone out. One day, I grew careless. I let myself get really into the season finale of my favorite show. It was gripping, a fantastic story. Right at the height of the action, a young boy came up to my lounger and shook my arm. Surprised, I asked, "Who are you? How did you get in here?" He laughed and smiled brightly. "Silly daddy." My heart sank in my chest. I knew immediately what had happened. After a few masked questions, I discovered that he was 2 years old, and that he was my son. The agony and heartache filling my chest was nearly unbearable. Not only had I missed the birth of my son, I would never see or know the first years of his life. Mara and I had obviously gotten married and started a family in the time I'd lost, and I had no idea what joys or pains those years contained. It was snowing outside. Holding my sudden son in my lap, I sat and watched the flakes fall outside. What kind of life was this going to be if slips in concentration could cost me years? I had to get help. The church had no idea what to do. The priests didn't believe me, and told me I had a health issue rather than some sort of possession. The doctors didn't have any clue. Nothing showed up on all their scans and tests, but they happily took my money in return for nothing. By the time I ran out of options, I decided to tell March there was no way to know what this all looked like from her side. What was I like when I wasn't there? Did I still take our son to school? Did I still do my job? Clearly, I did, because she seemed to be none the wiser, but I still had a horrible feeling that something must have been missing in her life when I wasn't actually home inside my own head. But the night I set up a nice dinner in preparation, she arrived not by unlocking the front door, but by knocking on it. I answered, and found that she was in a nice dress. She was happily surprised by the settings on the table. A fancy dinner for a second date? I knew you were sweet on me. Thank the Lord I knew when to keep my mouth shut. If I'd gone on about being married and having a son, she might have run for the hills. Instead, I took her coat and sat down for our second date. Through carefully crafted questions, I managed to deduce the truth. This really was our second date. She saw relief and happiness in me, but interpreted that as dating jitters. I was just excited to realize that the entity wasn't necessarily eating whole portions of my life. The symptoms, as I was beginning to understand them, were more like the consequences of a shattered soul. The creature had wounded me, broken me into pieces. Perhaps I was to live my life out of order, but at least I would actually get to live it. And so it went for a few years, from my perspective. While minor changes in politics or geography would happen daily, major shifts in my mental location only happened every couple months. When I found myself in a new place and time in my life, I just shut up and listened, making sure to get the lay of the land before doing anything to avoid making mistakes. On the farthest flung leap yet, I met my 6-year-old grandson, and I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. He said, "Writer." I told him that was a fine idea. Then, I was back in month 2 of my relationship with Mar, and I had the best night with her on the riverfront. When I say the best, I mean the best. Knowing how special she would become to me, I asked her to move in. I got to live through what I'd missed the first go-around, and I came to understand that I was never mentally absent. I would always be there, eventually. When we were moving her boxes in, she stopped for a moment and said she marveled at my great love, as if I'd known her for a lifetime and never once doubted she was the one. That was the first time I'd truly laughed freely and wholeheartedly since the entity had wounded me. She was right about my love for her, but for exactly the reason she'd considered a silly romantic analogy. I had known her my whole life, and I'd come to terms with my situation and found peace with it. It wasn't so bad to have sneak peeks at all the best parts ahead. But of course I wouldn't be writing this if it hadn't gotten worse. The entity was still with me. It had not wounded me and departed like I'd wanted to believe. The closest I can describe my growing understanding was that the creature was burrowing deeper into my psyche, fracturing it into smaller pieces. Instead of months between major shifts, I began having only weeks. Once I noticed that trend, I feared my ultimate fate would be to jump between times in my life heartbeat by heartbeat, forever confused, forever lost. Only an instant in each time meant I would never be able to speak with anyone else, never be able to hold a conversation, never express or receive love. As the true depth of that fear came upon me, I sat in an older version of me and watched the snow falling outside. That was the one constant in my life. The weather didn't care who I was or what pains I had to face. Nature was always there. The falling snow was always like a little hook that kept me in a place. The pure emotional peace it brought was like a panacea on my mental wounds, and I'd never yet shifted while watching the pattern of falling white and thinking of the times I'd gone sledding or built a snow fort as a child. A teenager touched my arm. "Grandpa?" "Eh?" He'd startled me out of my thoughts, so I was less careful than usual. "Who are you?" He half grinned, as if not sure whether I was joking. Handing me a stack of papers, he said, "It's my first attempt at a novel. Would you read it and tell me what you think?" "Ah, of course. Pursuing that dream of being a writer, I see." He burned bright red. "Trying to, anyway." "All right. Run off, I'll read this right now." The words were blurry, and, annoyed, I looked for glasses I probably had for reading. Being old was terrible, and I wanted to leap back into a younger year, but not before I read his book. I found my glasses in a sweater pocket, and began leafing through. Mar puttered in and out of the living room, still beautiful, but I had to focus. I didn't know how much time I would have there. It seemed that we had relatives over. Was it Christmas? A pair of adults and a couple kids I didn't recognize tromped through the hallway, and I saw my son, now adult, walk by with his wife on the way out the door. As a group, the extended family began sledding outside. Finally, I finished reading the story, and I called out for my grandson. He rushed down the stairs and into the living room. "How is it?" "Well, it's terrible," I told him truthfully. "But it's terrible for all the right reasons. You're still a young man, so your characters behave like young people, but the structure of the story itself is very solid." I paused. I didn't expect it to turn out to be a horror story. He nodded. "It's a reflection of the times. Expectations for the future are dismal, not hopeful like they used to be." "You're far too young to be aware like that," I told him. An idea occurred to me. "If you're into horror, do you know anything about strange creatures?" "Sure. I read everything I can. I love it." Warily, I scanned the entrances to the living room. Everyone was busy outside. For the first time, I opened up to someone in my life about what I was experiencing. In hushed tones, I told him about my fragmented consciousness. For a teenager, he took it well. "You're serious?" "Yes." He donned the determined look of a grown man accepting a quest. "I'll look into it, see what I can find out. You should start writing down everything you experience. Build some data. Maybe we can map your psychic wound." "Wow. Sounds like a plan." I was surprised. That made sense, and I hadn't expected him to have a serious response. "But how will I get all the notes in one place?" "Let's come up with somewhere for you to leave them," he said, frowning with thought. "Then I'll get them, and we can trace the path you're taking through your own life, see if there's a pattern." For the first time since the situation had gotten worse, I felt hope again. "How about under the stairs? Nobody ever goes under there." "Sure." He turned and left the living room. I peered after him. I heard him banging around near the stairs. Finally, he returned with a box, laid it on the carpet, and opened it to reveal a bursting stack of papers. He exclaimed, "Holy crap." But of course, being a teenager, he didn't really say crap. Taken aback, I blinked rapidly, forgiving his guessing because of the shock. "Did I write those?" He looked up at me with wonder. "Yeah. Or, you will. You still have to write them and put them under the stairs after this." He gazed back down at the papers, then covered the box. "So you probably shouldn't see what they say. That could get weird." That much I understood. "Right." He gulped. "There are like 50 boxes under there, all filled up like this. Deciphering these will take a very long time." His tone dropped to deadly seriousness. "But I will save you, Grandpa. Because I don't think anyone else can." Tears flowed down my cheeks then, and I couldn't help but sob once or twice. I hadn't realized how lonely I'd become in my shifting prison of awareness until I finally had someone who understood. "Thank you. Thank you so much." And then I was young again, and at work on a random Tuesday. Once the sadness and relief faded, anger and determination replaced them. After I finished my work, I grabbed some paper and began writing. While the weeks shifted around me, while those weeks became days, and then hours, I wrote every single spare moment about when and where I thought I was. I put them under the stairs out of order. My first box was actually the 30th, and my last box was the first. Once I had over 50 boxes written from my perspective, and once my shifting became a matter of minutes, I knew it was up to my grandson to take it from there. I put my head down and stopped looking. I couldn't stand the river of changing awareness any longer. Names and places and dates and jobs and colors and people were all wrong and different. I'd never been older. I sat watching the snow fall. A man of at least 30 that I vaguely recognized entered the room. Come on, I think I finally figured it out. I was so frail that moving was painful. Are you him? Are you my grandson? Yes. He took me to a room filled with strange equipment and sat me in a rubber chair facing a large mirror twice the height of a man. The pattern finally revealed itself. How long have you worked on this? I asked him, aghast. Tell me you didn't miss your life like I'm missing mine. His expression was both stone cold and furiously resolute. It'll be worth it. He brought two thin metal rods close to my arm and then nodded at the mirror. Look. This shock is carefully calibrated. The electric zap from his device was startling, but not painful. In the mirror, I saw a rapid arcing light silhouette appear above my head and shoulder. The electricity moved through the creature like a wave, briefly revealing the terrible nature of what was happening to me. A bulging leech-like mouth was wrapped around the back of my head, coming down to my eyebrows and touching each ear, and its slug-like body ran over my shoulder and into my very soul. It was a parasite. And it was feeding on my mind. My now adult grandson held my hand as I took in the horror. After a moment, he asked, removing it is going to hurt very badly. Are you up for this? Fearful, I asked, is Mar here? His face softened. No. Not for a few years now. I could tell from his reaction what had happened, but I didn't want it to be true. How? We have this conversation a lot, he responded. Are you sure you want to know? It never makes you feel better. Tears brimmed in my eyes. Then I don't care if it hurts, or if I die. I don't want to stay in a time where she's not alive. He made a sympathetic noise of understanding and then returned to his machines to hook several wires, diodes, and other bits of technology to my limbs and forehead. While he did so, he talked. I've worked for 2 decades to figure this out, and I've had a ton of help from other researchers of the occult. This parasite doesn't technically exist in our plane. It's one of the lesser spawns of mu negation sharp S-mu, and it feeds on the plexus of mind, soul, and quantum consciousness/reality. When details like names and colors of objects changed, you weren't going crazy. The web of your existence was merely losing strands as the creature ate its way through you. I didn't fully understand. I looked up in confusion as he placed a circlet of electronics like a crown on my head in exact line with where the parasite's mouth had ringed me. What's mu negation sharp S-mu? He paused his work and grew pale. I forgot that you wouldn't know. You're lucky, believe me. After a deep breath, he began moving again, and placed his fingers near a few switches. Ready? This is carefully tuned to make your nervous system extremely unappetizing to the parasite, but it's basically electroshock therapy. I could still see Mar's smile. Even though she was dead, I'd just been with her moments ago. Do it. The click of a switch echoed in my ears, and I almost laughed at how mild the electricity was. It didn't feel like anything, at least at first. Then, I saw the mirror shaking, and my body within that image convulsing. Oh. No. It did hurt. Nothing had ever been more painful. It was just so excruciating that my mind hadn't been able to immediately process it. As my vision shook and fire burned in every nerve in my body, I could see the reflected trembling light silhouette of the parasite on my head as it writhed in agony equal to mine. It had claws, 6-clawed lizard-like limbs under its leech-like body, and it cut into me in an attempt to stay latched on. The electricity made my memories flare. Mar's smile was foremost, lit brightly in front of a warm fire as the snow fell past the window behind her. The edges of that memory began lighting up, and I realized that my life was one continuous stretch of experience. It was only the awareness of it that had been fragmented by that feasting evil on my back. I'd never managed to be there for the birth of my son. I'd jumped around it a dozen times, but never actually lived it. For the first time, I got to hold Mar's hand and be there for her. No. That moment had shifted seamlessly into holding her hand as she lay in a hospital bed for a very different reason. Not this. God, why? It was so merciless to make me remember this. I broke down in tears as nurses rushed into the room. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to experience it. I'd seen all the good parts, but I hadn't wanted the worst part, the inevitable end that all would one day face. It wasn't worth it. It was tainted. All that joy was given back 10,000-fold as pain. The fire in my body and in my brain surged to sheer white torture, and I screamed. My scream faded into a surprised shout as the machines and electricity and chair faded away. Snow was no longer falling around my life. I was out in the woods on a bright summer day. Oh God! I turned to see the creature approaching me. It was the same absence of meaning, the same blank on reality. It crept forward, just like before, but, this time, it hissed and turned away. I stood, astounded at being young again and freed from the parasite. My grandson had actually done it. He'd made me an unappetizing meal, so the predator of mind and soul had moved on in search of a different snack. I returned home in a daze. And while I was sitting there processing all that had happened, the phone rang. I looked at it in awe and sadness. I knew who it was. It was Marjorie, calling for the first time for some trivial reason she'd admit 30 years later was made up just to talk to me. But all I could see was her lying in that hospital bed dying. It was going to end in unspeakable pain and loneliness. I would become an old man, left to sit by myself in an empty house, his soulmate gone long before him. At the end of it all, the only thing I would have left, sitting and watching the falling snow. But now, thanks to my grandson, I would also have my memories. It would be a wild ride, no matter how it ended. On a sudden impulse, I picked up the phone. With a smile, I asked, "Hey, who's this?" Even though I already knew. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel and post some ghost emojis in the comments.